so welcome back everybody after our short break. I just want to remind you that we have a raffle going on right now. We have great wins. We have a 3D printer, we have some IT starter kits, swag packs, coffee mugs, you know, just take part. We have the link for the raffle in our Twitter account, so make sure to participate. So next up we will have Esther talking about transitioning ops to the cloud and adding dev skills to the mix. Okay, Esther, it's your show.
Vielen Dank, Leo. Ich habe eine Introduktion auf Deutsch vorbereitet, aber ich werde mal die Präsentation auf Englisch machen, wie das anders vielleicht 2 Stunden dauert. So, just to make sure that I keep it in the spirit of the event. So, hi everyone. As I mentioned, I'm going to switch to English because that will mean I can do the presentation in the 45 minutes that I have right now. And let's get started. So today, for those of you who do not already know me, my name is Esther Barthel. I've been a technical consultant for over 20 years now, mostly focused on end-user computing, where I've been doing all the different roles from managing, administrating, operations, to design, to architecture, full end-user computing solutions, virtual desktops mostly. And some of you may also know me because I'm very active in different community programs like the Citrix Technology Professionals, Microsoft MVP, VMware vExpert, and I'm a very proud founder and leader and mentor of the Citrix User Group Community Women in Tech Mentorship Program. Where we do one-on-one mentoring with, Citrix-focused women, trying to encourage them, help them, support them, coach them in becoming more active, more visible within our IT community. And the last 6-7 years, I've been mainly focused on automation and DevOps, where it started with automated deployments, configurations of Windows, Citrix, and nowadays it's more even cloud focused. So I just love playing around with REST APIs, JSON, YAML, and PowerShell, basically any kind of template that helps me in automating configurations in cloud and deployments. So today I want to focus on what I mentioned at the beginning, DevOps, and especially how to transition from your operations role into a more modern cloud DevOps focused role. What are the skill sets that you should focus on, or that you can focus on in our case? First of all, when I started with the whole DevOps and automation, for me, it was already trying to figure out, even if you look at the definition of DevOps, where it said it's a set of practices that combines software development, dev, and IT operations, ops. But still, even though it has this really cool logo of the infinite cycle of using all these different techniques, methodologies like coding, building, deploying, taking care of monitoring even, and then going back to the next iteration, it still doesn't fully explain what skill sets you should focus on. So I thought it would be best to start off with basically asking, so where on the scale, if we have dev on one side and ops on the other side, where on that scale should, in my opinion, should I point DevOps, or should I position the DevOps role? So from my experience, and I do have some developer experience building web applications when I started in IT, having extreme or a lot of experience in the operation sides, for me, it definitely feels like DevOps is more lingering towards the dev side. And I'll explain that during this presentation. One of the other things that I realize, if we're looking at DevOps or if we're talking about DevOps right from the start, usually people already start to talk about all the cool applications and methods that are out there to support a DevOps way of working. But I figured it would be best to go back to the core and to the start and first focus on the DevOps processes that I feel definitely differ from my daily operational life. So if we're looking at the way we approach projects from the operation side of view towards the new, more DevOps focused way, what you see is that we all kind of started with the waterfall method. That was the project style that we used a lot of years, where we basically just had these linear phases that we could walk through, and we wouldn't pick up or start with the next phase until the previous one was finished. That means that we had a very clear view understanding of the tasks that were at hand, starting with the requirements, moving on to design documents, making sure that we not only have high level but also detailed design documents before we even start to build our solution. And then after it's built, fully tested, that's the moment where we do like a big bang or release it into production. And that also means that we only have that option at the end of the waterfall method to check the added value that we bring to the table for our end users. And of course, that is speaking from my own experience, mostly in the end user computing topic area. If we're looking at Agile, it's a whole different approach. What you see is it's shorter cycles, shorter bursts, where we still have that requirement build and release phases in there, but it's a circular motions, which means that we have multiple times to check if we bring the added value to our end users. And even though that first release might not have all the cool features that you intend, it definitely gives you an additional moment in time to get feedback and to make sure that you're still on the right track. And maybe even your implementation or your interpretation of the requirements might not fully line up or be aligned with your end users. So I think it's definitely an added plus with the Agile way of working to get those multiple moments of validation. And for those of you who have been in the industry a bit longer, just as I am almost feeling a dinosaur already, you might recognize some of these tree swing pictures that were used in the past to make you aware of different interpretations that users may have. So it's always very important to keep double checking if you're still on the right track. And what you see in this example especially is that waterfall method started with the design, build a great option, and then during testing phase basically discovered that there was not a lot of swing possible with their first design. So they just tweaked it a little bit and definitely make sure that they met the requirements when they had their release. What you see with the Agile process is that due to the fact that you have multiple iterations of that design, building, and release phase, that you have the opportunity to tweak some of those settings at the beginning. So this is just to give you an idea of how those different approaches can have different end results. And once again, focusing on those two methods or the differences between the two methods. Waterfall, definitely very sequential, linear stages, and it's definitely a good method if you have a simple project and you do not expect a lot of changes, especially in the requirements or user expectations, where Agile is more focused on continuous cycles and has a more flexible or continuous evolution embedded in the method. And last but not least, even if you look at the way teams are organized, you'd immediately see the kind of different approaches with both teams. Waterfall, very hierarchical, where Agile is all focused on self-organizing and cross-functional teams. So hopefully that already gives you an idea of what the different way of working is going to be, how your mindset will need to change or need to be very open-minded towards a different way of working. Because definitely in our DevOps approach, the Agile way of working gives us the best results. And if I'm talking about Agile, I also need to mention Scrum, or the way that Scrum teams and Scrums are organized in combination with an Agile way of working. So this is just a quick overview of how that Agile Scrum process is organized. So what you see most importantly is that there are three major roles within an Agile or Scrum team. That's the Scrum Master, who's there to facilitate the processes, the product owner, who makes sure that he keeps track of the product backlog. That's basically all the requirements, all the requests, user requests, and the product owner is responsible of setting the right priorities and making sure that we understand and we agree with the sprint planning that is going to be, or the items that are going to be part of that sprint backlog for the current sprint. And as you can see, a sprint takes about 1 to 4 weeks, so it is meant to be very short cycles. And of course, there's the team itself. And the cool part is that with an Agile Scrum process, you as a team also influence that sprint planning. You also have a say in whether or not you think the sprint backlog items are manageable, if you are able to produce results to have that release at the end of your sprint. Focusing once again on that Scrum team, one of the things that I think is really important to realize is that especially if you focus on the development or DevOps team within your Scrum team, is that I just love the whole we're in this together mentality that you see quickly evolve when a team gets started. And that's not just because it's focused on cross-discipline team, but I love how each team member feels responsible for making sure that all the way from the start, all the way through the life cycle of a product or a solution, they feel responsible for making sure that the user has a great experience. And that's basically what I mean with we're all in this together. Because as I mentioned before, and that's especially why I underlined it, it's all about cross-discipline. So this doesn't mean that everyone in the team has to have full knowledge of all the aspects of the solution or the product. You still have the opportunity to specialize, but it also means that when you are looking at the different items on your sprint backlog, you know those items that you feel most comfortable with are the ones that you will probably pick up. And that could be because they're aligned with your specialism, or it can even be because you want to extend your knowledge and be a bit more adventurous. The other big thing that you hear about with daily scrums or with Scrum teams is that daily scrum. And the main thing that I like to take, that I want to give you as an advice for how to handle daily scrums, because I have to admit at the beginning it kind of felt like I was kind of wasting 15 to 30 minutes at the beginning of every workday. It felt like the middle school kind of circles that we had of how was your weekend. But the goal of a daily Scrum is not to just brag about all the items that you finished yesterday and all the cool things that you are going to claim for today. I think the biggest question that needs to be answered in a daily Scrum is, what is in my way? Which impediments are you facing? Because that allows the creative process of the team. That gives your other team members, even if you are not conscious about asking for help, but it does give the other team members an opportunity to speak up, to offer some new insights, to maybe offer even a different viewpoint on the challenge that you're facing, and they might even surprise you and help you finish that task or that item faster than you thought at the beginning of the day. So that's why I think you definitely need to put some effort in that daily Scrum, and do not feel afraid to just tell people what challenges you are facing, because they might surprise you and have an awesome, cool answer and give you the opportunity to gain new knowledge and give them the opportunity to share knowledge. I already mentioned it a couple of times. I know from an operational and especially a daily operational task point of view, working in an Agile Scrum team does come with different opportunities and different ways of working. And for me, that felt as a real challenge and an opportunity to also look at a more creative, proactive approach in the way I do my work. And what I mean with that is, especially if you look at the two main methods of or work methods to work with the backlog items. You have that prototyping opportunity. And what I mean with that is that it allows a very creative environment where you get to pitch your ideas for adding a new feature or building the foundation of your solution. Basically, it offers with prototyping the option to test an idea, to work on it, to see if the basic concept definitely works for this product or this solution, and then build on top of that, or maybe even just discard that idea, know with the knowledge that you have now that that wasn't the best approach, and figure out an alternative and work out that idea as well. So that's what I mean with prototyping. It's a lot, well, it's almost like Lego. You just get to play around with all these different components and then be surprised at this awesome, cool castle or fort or boat or whatever you're building. But that also means that you have to be aware of what we call the minimum viable product. And the reason why I also wanted to address that one is that it is very important to understand that even though we're talking about prototyping, due to the fact that we have these short cycles, the focus should not be on building a rocket. A full rocket like NASA rocket scientists. It should be on making sure that you understand what the minimal set of features or requirements are that you need to meet in this sprint. And then you can focus on making sure that you build the best possible solution for those features. And your solution in the end, because there will always be another sprint that can help you focus on those features that are not now the highest priority. So do not be afraid to be creative, to test out ideas, but also realize that it's not about getting everything done at the first go, but making sure that you keep track of the minimum viable product that you agreed upon. I hope that gives you a clear understanding of what DevOps is all about from a processes, from a way of work perspective. And I know I told you I didn't want to zoom in on all the tools, but I do think there are some basic tooling that I need to explain, because those will probably be very new to you, especially if you're coming from an ops background, like they were new for me. And what I mean with the set of tools, or that DevOps toolkit that I think will help you quickly adapt to the DevOps way of working, is that it's all focused on collaboration. And in order to be able to collaborate as a team and work on the same solution or the same product code together, you need to have some systems in place. And what I'm talking about is like a centralized storage or repository that allows you to have that specific build code available to each team member. But at the same time, you want to be able, or you want to enable those each and every team member to have a copy of that code and run it locally on their own systems, so they can just be creative with it, test out their ideas, focus on that particular backlog item that they are working on right now. But you still want them to have their own code environment. So there needs to be something in place that will help you edit and test your code locally. And of course, once you're finished and you feel very proud of the solution that you created or the code that you built, it also needs to support giving back to the team, making sure that that little piece of your code is merged back into the full set, the new version of the build that you're working on. That's a very quick description of basically summarizing the functionality that we're looking for in source control, or Git, as most people know the most famous source control tooling. So what I mean with source control and what is all this about centralized repositories, local environments, and I know there are a lot of different terminologies that immediately are almost shouted, thrown at you once you get started with DevOps. And I, for one, definitely had to learn. So this kind of is my cheat sheet that will help me understand all those different mechanisms. So first of all, let's focus on that central repository. What you see is the remote repository here, and how I, as a team member or as a developer, can make sure that I still that I copy that code to my local device, to my local working area. And as you can see, if I make a copy of that code stored in the central repository to my local system, that is called cloning. And you probably have, for those of you who have some experience, have seen that clone button in GitHub or even Azure DevOps. So now I have my own local copy, and that means that I can start changing that code. And by changing that code, I still want to have a mechanism that allows me to basically create like snapshots, to have moments in time that I can revert back to, because I want to be creative. I want to test out ideas, but I also want to feel that freedom where I can just throw away some of the code that isn't working, not worry about it until I might discover that throwing away wasn't so smart, and bring it back, revert back to that point in time where that part of the code was still in my changes before the last change. To make sure that I have those little snapshots, I can make commits with Git. And that means basically what I say is like a snapshot. It's a point in time that I can revert back to in case that is needed. And that allows me to keep track of the changes, to feel free enough to make changes to my code, so I can only concentrate on that particular feature that I want to develop, and then still know in the back of my head, if there is a problem later on, I can always go back to that point in time where my code was still working before I added a new functionality to it. And as I mentioned at the beginning, you do want to keep track of the changes that are made, because I'm probably not the only team member that is working with their own local copy. So that means that I also have other team members that might, before the end of the sprint, already push back code to the central repository. Because if I want to make sure that the changes I made to the code, because I feel good about it, because they have been tested, they are working, I want to make sure that those are stored back in the central repository, I can use a git push to make sure that all the changes locally are synchronized back to the central repository. The other way around, if I want to make sure that one of my other teammates' changes are copied back to my local repository, I can do a pull and make sure that those changes are back on my system. And last but not least, if I want to do it both ways with the same call, I can just use a git sync. So hopefully this will help you too in understanding how to work with a source control system. Because there's another very important process or a methodology that you need to understand if we're talking about source control. And that is all about branches. So if we're talking about branches, basically what we mean is that if we're looking at the mainstream of code and code changes, we also want to be able to create an additional copy of that mainstream code, because we want to maybe even just zoom in on a little feature. And to ensure that any changes that I put back into the central repository does not conflict with any changes of my other team members, or maybe even render their tests useless because my code was not fully complete or fully functional, I can create a separate branch for myself to work on that specific feature, to have full focus on that little part of the code. And have my test runs with it. And in the end, when I think I improved it, and I want to make sure that that code is also part of the next release, I might just want to be able to merge all the changes from my separate branch back into that main branch, so to speak. So once again, making sure that I create my own branch, which is a full copy of the code. Basically, it's like a commit, but this time it gets its own history table and versioning. So that allows me to link all those changes of my code to that specific branch. So I can have all my different commits in there. All the changes are logged specifically to this branch, so they are not immediately implemented into that main branch. And then I can decide that once I'm ready to give that code back, or make sure that that code becomes part of that main branch again, I can open what we call a pull request. And a pull request is a great opportunity to also include a review process of my code or of the changes that I made, and to maybe even get some feedback from my team members on whether or not I built some solid code, whether or not I might have overlooked that one of my changes might have impact on the other code out there. But it also allows me to build some policies in there for how we as a team handle changes that will impact the mainstream of my code and my product or my solution. Because you can also apply policies that basically state that you want to have approval of one or more team members before the merge is actually happening. So hopefully that gives you a good understanding of why I would want to make a branch. And now let's talk about some branching strategies. And important with branching strategies is that you keep it simple and workable for your team. So once again, as I said, in this case, I have multiple branches with different commits or different version moments. The main one is there, which basically represents my most stable version. I do make sure that as a team, I have my separate development branches. And even if I work on a specific feature, as I explained previously, I can have my own branch as well. And if an occasional hotfix might have to be developed very quickly, I can have just a quick branch off for that hotfix, test it, and once it actually is working, make sure that it's as soon as possible integrated again within the main branch. If I'm linking that back to the Agile Scrum method, then what you see if you want to keep a simple branching strategy is that your main branch is all about the releases to production, so to speak, and your development branches are all focused on the different sprints that you have. And where a work item or a backlog item within that sprint can result in another branch for you specifically to work on. And as you can see, that can also mean that sometimes a branch only has a short lifespan, and new branches like the supporting ones will probably end way before the next sprint is started. So hopefully, to quickly summarize it, the main branch usually has the most stable versions of your code. Release branches are like short-lived stables because those are to ensure that you either incorporate, test a hotfix, make sure with the pull request it's quickly introduced to a patch or a new minor release of your main branch. And you can even have pull request to different branches to make sure that that hotfix is also immediately part of your in development code, as you can see in this development branch. Because the reason why I'm kind of rushing a little bit is because I want to make sure that I finish on time, and there's so much more fun stuff that I want to share. Because I think the biggest fun with the whole DevOps movement is that automation is key. And maybe it's me just being excited about all the automating possibilities that we have nowadays. So bear with me if you are still a bit nervous about this whole automation. The reason why I think automation is key is because we are moving at a crazy fast pace of new releases if we're talking about cloud development. Our cloud vendors are like daily changing features, adding features, giving us new possibilities. So having a GUI and manually having to build deployments or build configurations, I think that's not the most challenging part. The real fun is in finding the right workflow, so to speak, to make sure that we can have an automated configuration or deployment. So basically what I'm talking about is using pipelines, because they are the cool new I was going to say trend, but that's not the right pronunciation. They are the new kid on the block. But if you look at what a pipeline is all about, then you will recognize some of the terminologies. Because from my point of view, it's all about making sure that you have a workflow and that you understand all the different tasks and the order in which tasks are performed. And that can be manual at start, but then pick all those different little tasks and start to create automated actions for them. One of the things with pipelines is that it's not just a workflow, but it also allows you to specify what we call events or triggers. And that could be an integration with your source control system. So a trigger could also be that I have a pull request merging new code into my main branch, and therefore I want to make sure that my production environment is running with the latest and greatest. So it will automatically start the workflow that will make the configuration of my production environment. But that event could also be a schedule. For instance, speaking once again from my end user computing experience, what if I want to have a weekly build of my golden image, and I want to make sure that that one runs on a Saturday or a Sunday when the least amount of users will be impacted by it, and it can automatically be built and implemented, and maybe even automatically tested by pipelines. The sky is the limit. If we're zooming in on the workflow, basically it's a collection of jobs. And each job consists of a number of steps which all execute an action. And what you need to understand is that each job runs on its own runner. So that means that if you want to, for instance, exchange information between jobs, that might be an interesting challenge. So this is just an simple workflow that I created that checks if persistent VDI has enough free disk space, and if it doesn't, it will automatically extend the disk. Of course, there are some limitations to how much it can extend it, what the maximum size of a disk is, but I think you get the idea. So what I did for this workflow is that I defined 3 different jobs, so to speak, and each job consists of a number of steps. But if we're looking at the different jobs, there's one that checks the free disk space on the VDI. There's one that extends the virtual disk on the hypervisor level, and there's a job that makes sure that the partition in the VDI is extended to use that extra disk space. And last but not least, I also have a monitoring action, which right now is mostly done by the administrators to get a more positive vibe on how that workflow or pipeline will help them. As I mentioned at the beginning, because each job is run on a clean runner or agent, that means that there's after this job is done, there's no information left on that agent. So if I get to the next stage, I need to make sure that I can pass information between those jobs. And to do that, I'm using something called artifacts. In my case, it's a CSV file with information with a subset of VDI machines that I'm passing on that have all the check marks. In this case, do not have enough free disk space, so they need to have the next action performed on them. That's just to give you an idea of the pipeline. So for me, to make sure that everyone within the team can focus on the tasks, I'm always using a written out workflow or a graph of the workflow, so to speak, just because that means that if you're not as experienced in pipelines or reading pipelines, you still have a very clear visual image of what the tasks are, what needs to be performed, and you can even give feedback if some of the tasks do not make sense. So these are, as I mentioned, the different stages or jobs translated into Azure DevOps pipeline. And of course, I can even zoom in on those jobs and show you the different steps that are defined in it. We're talking about code because if I'm talking about making sure that my pipelines are developed or written in code, in this case YAML for Azure DevOps, then I can have that same code stored in my GitHub or Git repository and make sure that it immediately has that source control kicking in. And just to show you, just to give you a one tip, so the other thing that I do if I'm using, for instance, multiple tasks to build a script or have multiple steps combined in one script, I always make sure that the description of each step is also commented in the scripts. So you can easily zoom in on those sections in the script where it's running those steps. That's just the way I like to organize my code, because if I put good comments in those scripts, then it's easier for the next team member to add new functionality to it. Last but not least, if we're talking about DevOps, especially cloud DevOps, we're nowadays always immediately start to talk about everything as code. And what I mean with that, especially once again with my end user computing background, is that I not just want to focus on infrastructure as code, so having a coded basement to deploy infrastructure in the cloud or maybe even in my own data center, but I'm also talking about image as code, making automating the golden image build process, or maybe even workspace as code, automating the configuration of my control plane. In my case, it can be Citrix Cloud, it can even be Azure Virtual Desktops, but that ensures that workspace configuration is also in code and can easily be updated by the same principles as the agile processes that I described earlier on. And what do I mean with infrastructure as code? Well, I think the main thing to realize is that with infrastructure as code, I'm using some DevOps tooling. In this case, it's HashiCorp Terraform. That tool allows me to quickly, based on a configuration file, which usually is a template, it could be in the HashiCorp language, but this is a declarative file that basically states all the resources that I want created. And I don't care how they are created or what the specific tasks are that, in this case, Terraform needs to perform. I just want to know which template I need to provide, which code do I need to provide to Terraform to make sure that those resources that I need are created either in a public cloud or even a private cloud like my own data center. So that's when I'm talking about infrastructure as code, is what I'm talking about. Still using DevOps tools that are available out there, but my main focus is on the code. And if we're taking that to the next level, of course, being an MVP, being focused on Azure as well, I definitely need to have a shout out for Azure Bicep, because that also makes creating ARM templates a lot easier and more intuitive. And that allows me to also, once again, focus on the code to get all my resources created in Azure. And it's not just about one set of code. Like I said, I can do infrastructure image as code, combine it all, have those templates for Packer, templates or playbooks for Ansible, templates for Terraform, all stored in my repository, and easily use pipelines to make sure that everything is combined and organized. And I think you're kind of getting the idea. So once you start playing around with those automated tasks, don't be surprised if you look back on what you created. Like the first iteration might just have a couple of steps, but maybe a year in, you might discover that you created this awesome new fully automated deployment testing. Well, the sky is the limit. So even though I do not want to focus this presentation on all the cool tools that are out there, I think you're getting the idea that there are so many possibilities to be creative, to share all these cool automated workflows with the community. So go out there, be creative, and hopefully I get to talk to you very soon, maybe even very soon in person, to have some fun with DevOps. So with that, I'm at the end of the presentation. I want to say thank you. And I'll definitely check out the chats to make sure that if there are any questions, I can address them. But also feel very free to reach out to me through social media. And I'd be happy to answer and talk some more DevOps with you all. So thanks for having me, and back to the studio.